Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with Taddy Noy. Today, in our continuing discussion episode for Exodus chapter 21, we're going to take a deeper look at some of the most difficult, often controversial, and yet contextually rich parts of this chapter. Parts that may challenge our modern views, but reveal the ancient social world in which these laws emerged. We're not going to repeat what we covered in the previous deep dive. Instead, we'll explore lesser known implications and deeper cultural dimensions. Let's go. First, let's revisit the structure of law in the ancient Near East. Exodus 21 is a section of what scholars call the Covenant Code. This is Israel's earliest legal collection, and its format closely parallels Mesopotamian codes like the Code of Hammurabi. What's fascinating is that these similarities point to a shared legal culture, yet the differences tell us something deeply unique about Israel's emerging identity. Where Hammurabi's code presents the king as the final authority and protector of justice, the Torah makes Yahweh the source of law. This is a massive shift. In Israel, justice is not defined by royal power, but by covenantal relationship with a divine moral God. This subtle but revolutionary foundation repositions law as not merely civic, but sacred, anchored in holiness. One underappreciated aspect of Exodus 21 is how it seeks to humanize people who are vulnerable in ancient society: servants, women, and victims of injury. That doesn't mean it aligns with modern values of equality. It doesn't, but for its time, it reflects a surprising concern for restraint, regulation, and dignity in an age where vengeance and domination were the norm. Take, for example, verses 2 through 6 about Hebrew slaves. It may be jarring to see slavery permitted in any form, but this needs to be read in its economic context. This wasn't race-based chattel slavery like in modern Western history. Rather, it was primarily indentured servitude, usually a voluntary act done to pay off debt. That's revolutionary. What's revolutionary is the limit: 6 years of service, then freedom. Now that's unheard of in ancient legal systems. The seventh year rest anticipates the Jubilee principle, a radical vision of economic reset and human dignity. Even more fascinating is the scenario where a servant chooses to stay with his master because he loves him and his household. The ritual of piercing the ear at the doorpost is rich in symbolism. The doorpost connects to the Passover story and the covenantal threshold. The pierced ear may represent permanent belonging, not in a dehumanizing way, but as a personal and familial choice. There's more agency in this than many assume. Let's move to verses 20 through 21 and 26 through 27, which deal with violence against servants. And again, troubling at first glance, but notice the master is held accountable for harm. In the ancient Mesopotamian law, the death of a slave was often considered minor or compensatable with silver. Here we have explicit concern for bodily harm and recognition of the servant's personhood. If a tooth or an eye is lost, the servant goes free. This isn't just compensation, it's emancipation. The law limits the master's power. It's still a hierarchical world, but God's law is infusing it with restraint. Now, anthropologically, this shows us a society in transition, moving from tribal customs towards covenantal ethics. Ancient Israel isn't an egalitarian society, but its laws are injecting values of mercy, boundaries on power, and concern for the weak. That's rare in its time. We should also explore the laws regarding injury between two men and what happens when pregnant women is struck in verses 22 to 25. This text contains the famous eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth phrase, lex talionis. Often misunderstood as harsh, it was actually a limitation on violence or vengeance. In tribal societies, retaliation often escalated. You injure my brother, I kill your cousin. Lex Lex Talionis was designed to stop the cycle. It wasn't always literally applied. Many rabbis and scholars interpret it as symbolic or proportional justice, often fulfilled through monetary restitution. But the part about the pregnant woman is striking. Pun intended. If she is injured, the man is fined. But if harm follows, more serious punishment is given. This phrase has been debated for centuries. Does harm refer to the woman, the unborn child, or both? The Hebrew is ambiguous. What's important is this. There's a legal protection acknowledged for the life involved. That's rare in ancient law. Many cultures didn't even list protections for unborn life. Here it's addressed, even if not in ways we might expect today. Let's now talk about the laws surrounding the rights of female servants, particularly verses 7 through 11. These are difficult, especially for modern ears. A father selling his daughter into a form of servitude for marriage arrangement was sadly common in the ancient world, primarily for economic survival. What's noteworthy here is the protective clause if the man doesn't treat her properly, either by marrying her or by providing for her, she must be allowed to go free. There's no equivalent in other ancient law codes. In Hammurabi's code, failure to uphold marriage agreements often led to the woman being returned or punished. But Exodus 21 gives the woman legal agency, freedom, if her dignity is compromised. It's not modern feminism, but it is an early seed of it, a legal ethic concerning the protecting the vulnerable against male authority. Culturally, this chapter tells us Israel's story isn't just about escaping from Pharaoh. It's about building something new. The laws given here begin to form a moral society rooted not in domination, but in divine justice. These case laws may seem primitive, but they are scaffolding for a society learning how to reflect a just God in an unjust world. Thematically, we see Yahweh's fingerprint across these laws, not in their protection by our standards, but in their trajectory. They point forward to the prophets who would cry out against injustice, forward to the wisdom literature that would elevate the poor, forward to the teachings of Jesus, who quotes eye for an eye, not to endorse it, but to transcend it. You have heard it said, but I say to you, love your enemies. The covenant code is not the final word on justice in Scripture, nor is it meant to be read as a complete moral system. Rather, it is culturally embedded legal framework designed to function within the realities of the time, with incremental movement towards justice and covenantal responsibility. It's vital to understand that these laws emerged in a society that had just come out of slavery. The Israelites had no standing legal institutions, no courts, and no national precedent. So what we see in Exodus 21 is the beginning of a cultural and theological shift. God planting seeds of equity, mercy, and accountability within a world that would naturally function, that didn't naturally function that way. One of the deeper points of discussion among scholars is the way in which retributive justice, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, is framed not as vengeance, but as a limit. It sets a ceiling on punishment, not a floor. This is radically different from in many neighboring cultures of the time where justice could be wildly disproportionate, often depending on a person's class. The lex talionis in Exodus was a way to institutionalize fairness. We also need to talk about how economic justice shows up here. Much of Exodus 21's regulation of slavery and restitution is tied to property laws. But underneath that, we find concern for the dignity of the vulnerable, those without land, wealth, or family standing, in a world where poverty could mean permanent bondage. The Torah limits that bondage and commands humane treatment. That wasn't the norm. In ancient Mesopotamian law, debt slavery could be lifelong and brutal, but in Israel, a Hebrew servant was to go free in the 7th year, a sign of God's desire for redemption over permanence in oppression. There's also the anthropological significance of household law. Many of these regulations governed how people related them within their extended family units, masters, wives, children, and servants all under one roof. In ancient Israel, the house of the father was the basic building block of society. That's why so many of these laws are aimed at regulating household conduct, for striking one's parents to how servants are treated. The goal is a stable covenant community starting from the home. We can also explore the idea of corporate responsibility here. The law doesn't just punish individuals, it instructs communities. For example, the owner of a violent ox must take responsibility for its actions. If a person is gored and the owner had previous warning, there is guilt, not just negligence, but moral fault. This shows a profound understanding that we are interconnected. Our negligence affects others. Our actions ripple outwards. That idea of responsibility beyond ourselves is foundational to biblical ethics. Now, if you were raised in the modern Western context, reading Exodus 21 might feel jarring, especially because it doesn't abolish slavery or condemn violence in absolute terms. And it's okay to wrestle with that. But rather than dismiss the text, we need to dig into the trajectory of Scripture. These laws are part of a long, progressive movement that ultimately culminates in the teachings of Jesus. When Christ says in Matthew 5, "You have heard it said, eye for an eye, but I say to you," he isn't rejecting the Torah. He's completing it, pushing its moral arc even further towards mercy, reconciliation, and heart-centered justice. The ancient world wasn't ready for the Sermon on the Mount, but Exodus 21 was a beginning. It dignified the lowly. It set limits on retaliation. It called out negligence. And in doing so, it introduced a concept rarely seen in the Bronze Age, that every person, regardless of status, was accountable to the same divine moral order. Let's not overlook the boldness of that move. Now for some closing thoughts. As we wrap up this continuing the discussion episode on Exodus 21, I want to thank you for diving deep into what can be one of the most difficult chapters in the Bible. This isn't easy terrain, but it matters. The laws here show a God who doesn't ignore injustice, but works through the grit and reality of human culture, always moving towards redemption, always challenging us to treat others with dignity and fairness. Personally, I'm moved by how even in something as ancient as slave laws and restitution, we see glimpses of God's heart for freedom, for mercy, for accountability, for compassion. It reminds me that Scripture isn't meant to freeze us in time, but to form us through time. It's to shape our conscience, to invite us into a story that's still unfolding. If something stood out to you, if a verse sparked a thought or challenged something in your worldview, I'd love to hear about it. Please drop a comment below and share your insights. We're all learning together. Thank you for being here with me, and may you walk away from this conversation today reminded that God's justice always makes space for mercy, and that His law, even in its oldest form, was always moving us closer to Him. Thank you again for joining me today, and we will see you tomorrow in the next chapter.